Welcome to this another class on World History 4, and we are moving down nicely. I trust you have enjoyed the classes, and I trust that they have transformed your perspective on world history and on this world. You know, don't forget that history is recorded events, and it is about people, events, dates. Don't make the mistake of using history the lay people use it, the way the lay people use it. Don't use it like that. History is in the making. Jamaica is repeating history. This world is repeating history. History is repeating itself. Don't use it like that. Ordinary people use history that way. Ordinary people. And I don't expect you to be ordinary. Not again. Don't forget the definition. History is a systematic, evidence-based history is a systematic, evidence-based study of the human past, not the past itself. Let us pray. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the participants in this course. I commit them to you, and I commit myself to you. Lord, I ask for your strength, your guidance, your blessing, your leadership, your deliverance. In the precious name I pray. Amen. So last class we were on Vietnam and how the French colonized and manipulated them, abused them, and misuse them and exploited their country. We're going to pick up where we left off. And we were looking at the nationalist struggle in Vietnam for independence. So we're going to pick up there. We're going to look at the demise of the VNQDD. That is in the early 1920s. The nationalist struggle was centered in the clandestine Vietnamese Nationalist Party, Vietnamese Quoc Dan Dong. Remember that we don't speak that language. And the abbreviation is VNQDD. So the demise of the VNQDD left its major rival, the Communist Party of Vietnam, as a main focus of nationalist resistance in Vietnam. So that party that was not communist died or demised, but the Communist Party of Vietnam did not. As in China and Korea, the communist wing of the nationalist movement had developed in Vietnam during the 1920s, often at the initiative of leaders in exile. By the late 1920s, the party was dominated by the charismatic young Nguyen Ai Quoc, who would later be known as Ho Chi Minh, who had discovered Marxism while studying in France and Russia during and after World War I. Disillusioned by his failure to gain a hearing for his plea for the Vietnamese right to self-determination at the post-World War I Paris Peace Conference, Ho dedicated himself to a revolutionary struggle to drive the French from Indochina. Mhm. In the early 1930s, the Communist Party still held to the rigid but unrealistic orthodox vision of a revolution based on the urban working classes. Because the workers in Vietnam made up as small a percentage of the population as they had in China, the orthodox strategy made little headway. A sudden shift in the early 1930s to a peasant emphasis, in part to take advantage of widespread but not communist-inspired peasant uprisings in central Vietnam, led to a disaster almost as great as that which had overtaken the VNQDD a year before. French repression smashed the Communist Party hierarchy and drove most of the major communist leaders into exile, but the superior underground organization of the communists and the support they received from Comintern helped them survive the French onslaught. So the French came against them hard in their own country. The French were invaders, you know. Although I'm not a communist. I'm not a communist. I'll never be one. The fact is that they had rights and their cause was legitimate. Slowly during the late 1930s, the discredited Ho re-established his place in the party. The communists won growing peasant support because of their programs for land reform, higher wages for laborers, mass education, and health care. When the French were weakened by the Japanese invasion of Indochina in 1941, the communists were ready to use the colonizers. Set back to advance the struggle for national liberation. So now, during World War II, operating out of bases in South China, the communist dominated nationalist movement known as the Viet Minh established liberated areas throughout the northern Red River Delta. The abrupt end of Japanese rule left a vacuum in Vietnam, which only the Viet Minh was prepared to fill. Its programs for land reform and mass education had wide appeal among the hard-pressed peasants of the North, where they had been propagated during the 1930s, and especially during the war. The fact that the Viet Minh actually put their reform and communist building programs into effect in the areas they controlled won them very solid support among rural population. The Viet Minh's efforts to provide assistance to the peasants during a terrible famine of 1944 and 1945 also convinced the much abused Vietnamese people that here at last was a political organization genuinely committed to improving their lot. Under the leadership of General Vo Nguyen Giap, the Viet Minh skillfully used guerrilla tactics similar to those devised by Mao in China These offset the advantages that first the French and then the Japanese enjoyed in conventional firepower. With a strong base of support in much of the rural north and the hill regions, where they had won the support of key non-Vietnamese tribal peoples. So, the tactics that they resorted to, was superior to the traditional unconventional style of warfare that the French and the Japanese had been using. You see, the Japanese and the French fought for whatever their cause, but they were not really touching base with the people. It wasn't as if they were fighting for the people. But the communists became one with the people. They were with the people. And they were fighting for the people. They were defending the people's cause. So, with a strong base of support in much of the rural north and the hill regions, where they had won the support of key non-Vietnamese tribal peoples, the Viet Minh forces advanced triumphantly into the Red River Delta as the Japanese withdrew. By August 1945, the Viet Minh were in control of Hanoi, where Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the establishment of the independent nation of Vietnam. Although the Viet Minh had liberated much of the north, they had very little control in the south. In that part of Vietnam, a variety of communist and bourgeois nationalist parties jostled for power. The French, eager to proclaim their colonial empire, reclaim their colonial empire and put behind them their humiliations at the hands of the Nazis, were quick to exploit this turmoil. With British assistance, the French reoccupied Saigon and much of South and Central Vietnam. In March 1946, they denounced the August Declaration of Vietnamese independence. And moved to reassert their colonial control over the whole of Vietnam and the rest of Indochina. And then steady truce between the French and the Viet Minh quickly broke down. Soon Vietnam was consumed by a renewal of the Viet Minh's guerrilla war for liberation, as well as bloody infighting between the different factions of Vietnamese. After nearly a decade of indecisive struggle, the Viet Minh had gained control of much of the Vietnamese countryside, and the French, with increasing American financial and military aid, clung to the fortified towns. In 1954, the Viet Minh decisively defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in the mountain highlands. Here, the Laotian border must be near. It says here is near the border. The victory won the Viet Minh control of the northern portions of Vietnam as a result of an international conference at Geneva in the same year. At Geneva, elections throughout Vietnam were promised within 2 years to decide who should govern a reunited North and the still politically fragmented South. So there were North and South, just as Korea. Whoa. I remember in the 70s, the war in Vietnam, and the United States got involved in it. The French got weaker and weaker. The Americans got stronger and stronger in the war, and it went on to the 60s. It was during the time that they stripped heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay, of his title for refusing to go and fight war in Vietnam. He said he wasn't going to go. I did not go. He's not going. And no, I'm never in sympathy with the communists. And this is gone. It's late. But I must confess now that if I had been around, I would be fighting on the side of the communists for the liberation of the country. Yeah. So at a point, the southern part of Vietnam was fragmented, and it was under the control of the capitalist people, led by by the United States of America. But the North continued to fight to liberate it. It is now one Vietnam. The same thing should have happened with the Koreas, to make one Korea. We want to look briefly at decolonization with and without social revolution. As we have seen, independence was won in most of the non-settler colonized world, with little violence and very limited changes in Africa and Africa and Asian economies and social hierarchies. Vietnam provides a sharp contrast to this dominant pattern, despite the fact that it had few French settlers and was colonized by the French in much of the same way as the rest of Africa and Asia under European rule. The reason for the divergent path to independence taken by the Vietnamese tell us much about the origins of revolutionary change as opposed to gradualist, reformist political transformation. Revolutionary change is not the same as the gradualist. The gradualist reform, is one where you allow the colonizers to make up their minds. And in a crawling peg manner, give you a little rights, some rights, a little more and a little more until they're clean gone. And the revolutionary change is one where the colonized people organize themselves and drive out the invaders. Drive them out. They are rooted in the differences between Vietnam, China, Korea, and Cuba, and most of the rest of the post-colonial world. They are also tied to the exploitive and repressive nature of colonial rule under the French in Vietnam, as well as the consequences of the brief period of Japanese control in the area. Like the other peoples of East Asia, the Vietnamese already had a unified state, a common written and spoken language. And a strong sense of common identity long before the Europeans broke into their world. There were sharp cultural and political divisions between the lowland dwelling, wet rice growing Vietnamese and the multitude of slash and burn cultivating peoples who lived in the hills, but the Vietnamese made up an overwhelming majority of the people who occupied the areas that eventually made up the nation of Vietnam. French rule promoted Vietnamese dominance over the hill peoples. Mhm. As well as over the lowland peoples of neighboring Laos and Cambodia. It also intensified the traditional Vietnamese sense of identity, both by providing a foreign target for them to resist and by enriching that sense of identity with the European concepts of nation and patriotism. Like all peoples who had been deeply influenced by China's Confucian tradition, the Vietnamese found their political subjugation to the barbarian Europeans galling. Yes, I don't know problem. It's, yes, galling and humiliating. I don't have a problem with that. Their own long tradition of violent resistance to political foreign domination, whether by the Chinese, the Mongols, or the Mongols, also fed the Vietnamese determination to fight against the French conquest. In contrast to colonial India, Africa, and most of the rest of Southeast Asia, from the outset, Vietnamese cooperation with the French was branded by those who resisted French rule as a betrayal of the Vietnamese people and tradition. Also, in contrast to other colonized areas, the Vietnamese continued to violently resist the imposition of French rule long after the initial wars of conquest and pacification had ended. There was to be no early colonial period of peace and submissiveness in Vietnam. From the outset, the Vietnamese fought the French encroachments into their country with fierce determination. This violent struggle continued through most of the period of French rule. Yes. The crumbling of the Confucian order and the nature of French rule in Vietnam made it essential for those who tried to mobilize opposition to the French to promise far-reaching social and economic transformations. As in China and Korea, the failure of the Confucian elite in Vietnam to ward off the intrusions of the West led to the rejection of Confucian civilization as a whole. As a result, and in contrast to the peoples of most of the rest of Afro-Asian world, the Vietnamese were left without a tradition to defend and to revive as an alternative to the European colonialism. Unlike Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, elsewhere, the depoliticized, electric, and vague variant of Buddhism in Vietnam simply was not seen by the emerging nationalists of the country as a viable base on which to build a post-colonial order. Merely political responses were rendered insufficient by the fact that the breakdown of the Confucian system was paralleled by the worsening condition of the peasantry resulting from exploitative French policies. The substitution of French educated middle class Vietnamese politicians for French colonial officials would do little to alleviate the misery of the peasant farmers of the north or the plantation workers in the south. That was why the resistance movement gained such widespread support, because the resistance movements, resistance to foreign rule, the resistance movement was really fighting for the people. They were in touch with the people. They were fighting for the people's cause. French rule was not for the people. So the people saw it as an imposition. an invasion of their country and of their rights. And you can't. So the French would not have any. They did not have strong people support. No, they didn't have it. So there was no way they could last. In any case, the middle class could make little headway against determined repression by the French. Even in the political sphere, in contrast to the policies followed in most other non-settler colonies, the French prohibited all but the most benign political organizations. The Vietnamese press was tightly controlled. Even moderate political parties were smashed, and mass demonstrations of any kind were strictly prohibited. But look at that. The people were standing up for their rights. The Vietnamese press was tightly controlled. Even moderate political parties were smashed, and mass demonstrations of any kind were strictly prohibited. The French refused to negotiate seriously with, much less make any significant constitutional concessions to the bourgeois nationalists, whose collaboration was a major prop of their continued domination in Indochina. Under these circumstances, the gradual transfer of power from the colonizers to the nationalists, which had been a key factor in peaceful decolonization in other areas, was out of question. As a consequence, underground terrorist and guerrilla organizations such as the VNQDD and the Communist Party dominated the struggle for independence by the 1920s, because the French did want to negotiate, and they wanted them out. The Vietnamese were not in this gradual thing, transfer either. Get out. And why not? Get out. They were exploiting them. Even the Japanese takeover in the 1940s, which proved so crucial in strengthening the moderate constitutional nationalist organizations in Burma, Indonesia, the Philippines, and other areas they occupied, had a reverse effect in Indochina. For most of the period of occupation, the Japanese were content to let French collaborators linked to the Nazi puppet Vichy regime, then in power in France, continue to run the colony under their supervision. As a result, the policy of repressing nationalist organizations continued. Thus, any hopes for building a non-violent moderate party that could rival the communist-dominated Viet Minh were again crushed. The violent struggle against the Japanese, the French, and later the Americans only reinforced the revolutionary orientation of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Yes, the Americans got into it. And I would say they got the worst of it. They left Vietnam in disgrace. Time has gone, so I will not start a new subtopic at this point. Do your reflection and email me. God bless you.